I had this feeling that someone was there watching me, but I couldn't see anyone.
I was afraid for my children and myself because we were home by ourselves.
I just had a horrible feeling that something was wrong with the house.
I was really afraid, but what could I do?
Cindy awoke with a jolt. It was the strangest sensation, but as her brain rationalised what she had just felt, a chill shot through her, and she pushed her body deep against the back of the sofa, moving a few inches away from the edge, as if she hoped it would keep her safe. She grew increasingly convinced, her eyelids still throbbing slightly, as if someone had just grabbed her eyelash and yanked it. She looked around the room. There was no one there. She glanced over at the clock. Only an hour had passed since she dropped off to sleep. She was used to being awake most of the night by this point, but this was a new record. Cindy rolled onto her back and covered her face with her arm. It was just a dream, she kept telling herself. Just a dream, as the tingly pain subsided on her face. Then, Cindy screamed out. She jumped up, clutching her arm as she did. She was awake this time. She knew she felt that one for real. Someone had punched her in the arm. Hard. Eyes wide and adrenaline pumping, she glanced around the room again. Nothing. There was no one else here. Nowhere for someone to hide. At least, not that quickly. Then she felt it in her chest. The now familiar sensation of her heart skipping a beat. It always did this when it was near. This was followed by the equally familiar feeling that caused the hair on the back of her neck to stand up. The feeling of being watched. Her eyes were drawn towards the wall. The wall that separated the living room from the room her daughters would sleep in. She stared at the wall as the hours ticked by, until the sun finally began to rise. She couldn't see anything, but that didn't mean it wasn't there. Cindy was convinced that there was someone or something standing by that wall, waiting for her to let her guard down. Something was in this house with them, and Cindy had its full attention. Welcome to the tape library. The winter nights are drawing in, and at least where I am, it's feeling very dark and gloomy. The perfect time for a ghost story. This was actually a case I stumbled upon by accident, after mixing it up with another story I wanted to cover. But it turned out to be so interesting I thought it deserved its own episode as well. Despite being featured on a fairly popular TV show at one point, this is a case that appears to have almost been forgotten and rarely talked about. There are a few different sources that provide a pretty comprehensive accounting of what supposedly took place that I'll get into later, but I was shocked by how little there appears to be online about this one. There's a lot to dissect. Is this simply a disturbing story of an abusive relationship, mixed in with some very serious trauma, or an example of genuine paranormal activity? Well, that's for you all to decide. As always on this show, I will be presenting the story first, as close to as it was originally reported as possible, before later discussing any theories that could explain it. I try to present these stories as unbiased as I can, so that you can make up your own minds on what you believe. But before we begin, I want to take a moment to thank this episode's sponsor, Manta Sleep. Those of you who have been around for a while know that Manta is one of the only sponsors I work with, and that's because I genuinely like their masks. They offer a really wide range of quality sleep masks that are adjustable to offer total blackout. A few months ago they launched an update to one of my favourite masks, and the one I know a lot of you listening to this now use. The Sound 2 is their new Bluetooth sleep mask, with razor thin speakers either side. It is perfect for falling asleep listening to creepy stories. It sounds great, and the speakers are easily movable without taking off the mask. But I think the most important aspect for a sleep mask is comfort. Manta claims this is the most comfortable Bluetooth mask on the market, I can say from my experience it is very comfortable. They've somehow improved on the original to make it fit even nicer and be more breathable throughout the night. The battery has also been increased. From my experience, I was able to use this for a full week-long trip. If you want to check out the Sound 2 or any of the rest of Manta Sleep's range, then use the link in the description, or use the code TAPE at checkout to get 10% off your order. Also, every purchase made supports the show, so thank you Manta Sleep for your continued support, and without any further delay, let's get into tonight's story. Get yourself a warm drink, dim the lights and get comfortable. It's time to tell the story of the violent haunting of the Sarro family. Welcome to the Tape Library. In the spring of 1991, Cindy Sarro had been living in a rented duplex with her long-term boyfriend Glenn and her two daughters, 9-year-old Brooke and 7-year-old Christy. Cindy was a stay-at-home mum, a fact that had mostly been forced on her by a serious back injury that affected her mobility. Keen to move into a house of their own, there had been some discussion and at times arguments between Cindy and Glenn about where they should move to. Eventually it was decided they should move to Caseyville, Illinois, just a little over 10 miles from the city of St. Louis. Caseyville was small, but Cindy had ties there. Her mother lived in the area and had been suffering from a long-term illness for some time. Not knowing how long her mother might have, it helped make the decision for her. She wanted to be close to family. Despite not having a home in mind, the decision was made firm in Cindy's mind that Caseyville would be where they would settle down. But curiously, as soon as that decision was made, Cindy began to be plagued by a seemingly random recurring dream. Every night she would be in the same place, running down a darkened staircase in a house she didn't recognize. She never saw what she was running from, but she felt terrified, like whatever it was that was after her wanted to kill her. The first time it shook her up a little, but then the dream came back again and again. Cindy pushed it to the side of her mind, but on some level it must have been unsettling her, especially because Cindy had felt throughout her entire life that she was sensitive to what some call the other world. Was this just a dream, or was she seeing something she couldn't understand yet? This is the first detail about this case that I really think makes it stand out. Almost every haunted house story I cover, the families involved are reluctant to jump straight into the paranormal. Often they claim to not believe in ghosts, but Cindy Sarro is different in that regard. She was a believer, even if she didn't really understand what the paranormal was exactly. Her beliefs seemed fairly open-minded in this regard. She believed that she had experienced things throughout her life that she couldn't explain, a fact that admittedly could cloud her interpretations of what came later, but also, you could argue, would make her more receptive to whatever was awaiting the family. In Caseyville, Cindy was the first one to spot it. The house on the hill. A large barn-shaped house surrounded by flowers, with a circular drive and plenty of outdoor space. It was within walking distance of both Cindy's mother and Glenn's parents. It seemed perfect, but Cindy initially dismissed it due to the steep hill it was on. But when Glenn saw the place as he was driving past one day, unaware that Cindy had already seen it, he seemed to almost become obsessed. Glenn could see the potential of all the land that came with the property. Cindy, though, had seen another house that she preferred. It led to much arguing between the pair, but eventually Cindy gave in, and they put an offer in for the place that was quickly accepted. Due to being built on a steep hill, the house had a slightly strange layout. As you entered the house, there was a living room to your left. Straight ahead was a kitchen that led to a few other smaller rooms, but the ground floor was effectively built into the ground of the hill, leaving it quite dark and moody. The pair made a few visits to the property before the sale went through. The roof needed some work and was replaced before the move, but other than that, it all seemed to be perfect. That was until moving day came though. They approached the property and were unable to actually enter due to swarms of wasps and hornets. The beautiful flowers outside had attracted huge swarms of the creatures. Cindy thought it was strange that this hadn't been the case on any of their other visits, but they obviously couldn't leave it like this with two small children running around. They purchased a lot of bug spray, and once the wasps had been chased away, they set about the long task of digging out all of the flowers. Another strange detail that seemed different from their previous visits was the heat. Every time there had been prior, Cindy had noted how cool it was, but today it was roasting hot in the house. They simply put this down to the hard work of digging and moving boxes, so decided to get the windows open and get some air in. But oddly, most of the windows on the ground floor didn't open. They were basically fake windows. She thought a bath would be a good chance for the girls to cool off, so she sent them upstairs to run one. Moments passed and Cindy heard both the girls yelling and calling for her. She rushed into the bathroom to see the tap on the bath was pouring out a strange black liquid. Maybe this place wasn't quite in the good condition they thought it was, a fact that was confirmed as she started putting away items in the kitchen. She reached up to one of the upper cabinets to open it, and the door came off in her hand. She was frustrated, but before she could react, she let out a startled scream, as all of the other kitchen cabinet doors flew off, crashing to the floor. She couldn't understand or even begin to rationalise what had caused them all to fall like that. Glenn came to see what was wrong, but his explanation was just that the hinges were old and he could fix them. But Cindy was beginning to get a little weirded out. When they plugged in the toaster, the electrics all went out, but luckily Glenn was able to get it working again. They also noticed that the floor was drastically uneven in numerous rooms. How had they not noticed any of this before? Cindy was a little stressed out by all this, but her mood darkened further on their first night in the house. She hadn't noticed it in the day, but now the sun had set, she was sure of it. The staircase in their new home was the same one she had been dreaming about for the last few months. The next day brought more and more issues. When they tried to plug in their fridge, the socket broke through the wall as though it had been made of paper. The lights would go off and on at random intervals, as would the TV. At other times they would just seem to dim randomly. When she washed clothes, they would come out of the machine covered in a strange black oily substance that they were not able to find a source for. Frustrated, Cindy contacted the estate agent, demanding that they talk to the previous owners. But the previous owners denied any knowledge about these issues. They had lived in the house for years, and while the house was old and needed a little work, they had never experienced any of the events that Cindy was describing. Luckily, Glenn was handy and saw the property as a project, telling Cindy it would take a while, but they would get the place in shape. The girls quickly made friends though. There was a trailer just next to the new house where a woman named Kelly lived, with her boyfriend and her young son Sean, who bonded with Brooke and Christy, soon playing together every day. Glenn was working nights, so Cindy and her daughters would often be alone at home. Their fear didn't start out instantly, but one evening as Cindy began getting her daughters ready for bed, Brooke turned to her and practically begged her mother not to make them sleep in their room. Christy agreed with her sister. Neither of them wanted to stay in the room. Now, most parents would dismiss their child's demands like this as them simply getting used to a new home, but Cindy was having her own seemingly irrational fears. Something about the wardrobe in her bedroom made her really uncomfortable, and the fireplace also seemed to really unnerve her, so much so that she made Glenn promise not to light it. After a bit of back and forth, since Glenn wasn't there, Cindy agreed the girls could take her bed and she would sleep on the sofa in the living room, something that she didn't expect to become a practically permanent setup. Cindy put the TV on and drifted off to sleep. Suddenly she was jolted awake by something. She couldn't say what it was, The TV was still on, as were the lights. It was midnight. She glanced around the room trying to figure out what had suddenly startled her, but could see nothing. But for some reason, her attention was drawn to the wall. The wall that ran between the living room and the room her daughters had refused to sleep in. Something about it made her feel uneasy. The girl's bedroom was completely dark, but the door was slightly ajar. Cindy became convinced that someone was watching her from that room. After building herself up, she plucked up the courage to approach the room and turn the light on. There was nothing out of place. She sat back down on the sofa. There was no one there, but she still felt uneasy. Then she noticed a strange sensation in her chest. Her heart seemed to be skipping a beat. The next day, Cindy was exhausted. Shortly after sending the girls off to school, she sat back down on the sofa and began to drift off to sleep. The next thing she knew, she was standing up in her living room. Everything was just as it had been when she fell asleep, but with one slightly unsettling detail. She could see herself laying on the sofa, sleeping. Was this a dream? It felt so real. Her mind flitted back to a childhood memory. She had experienced something like this before, but not since then. But before she could make sense of what was happening, she was struck by something in her stomach. Cindy doubled over in pain. Then, whatever it was smacked into her back. Cindy began to scream out, and then it hit her again and again. She couldn't see anything hitting her, but it felt clear these were not internal pains. Something was striking her. She could feel the pain, the sensation. This was no dream. It hit her over and over until she was practically pleading on the floor. Then suddenly she shot awake, still lying on the sofa, the throbbing of the blows still present in her body, but no marks had been left. Terrified, Cindy spoke to her mother on the phone, who simply dismissed it as the stress of the move. Cindy had simply been overdoing it. All of this was in her head. She just needed some rest. She put the phone down, thinking her mother was right, but the chill returned when the TV in the girls' room suddenly turned on at full volume. Cindy glanced into the empty room and shuddered. An electrician finally visited the home and looked into what was going on. He made a strange discovery. He said it looked like someone had deliberately messed with the wiring to cause the issues they were having. He fixed it and it seemed to work for a little while, but quickly the issues seemed to return. Cindy began to notice something else odd. Small items would go missing. Keys wouldn't be where she left them. She would put something down, turn around, and it would be gone, even when no one else was in the house. Glenn was worrying that Cindy was struggling with the move, so he came up with a plan that he carried out without talking to his partner. He turned up one day with a puppy. She was not happy, and seemingly neither was the puppy. It was perfectly happy when it arrived in the garden out front, playing with the girls excitedly, but as soon as they tried to bring it inside, it dug its claws into the ground. When they did bring it in, it rushed straight to the back door, desperately trying to get out. These weren't just teething issues with the new dog. It never settled in the house the entire time they lived there, and any time they tried to bring it in, it would try and get back out as quickly as it could. Glenn purchased a doghouse, and the dog seemingly happily settled into its new life outside. Cindy was becoming increasingly run down because she was only getting 2 hours of sleep each night. The girls were still refusing to sleep in their own room, so she was finding herself on the sofa every night. But each time, she would fall asleep and then wake up exactly 2 hours later. Midnight every time. The same feeling of being watched would hit her, a feeling that was so vivid, it would leave her sitting on the sofa waiting for daylight each and every time. The next day, Cindy and Glenn got into a huge argument. She was the one who had purchased the house, but it was at his insistence. She argued that she'd made a mistake and should have gone with her original choice. Glenn thought she was just overreacting. Cindy stormed outside, slamming the door shut and leaving Glenn upstairs. The puppy was going crazy, barking as she stepped out into the garden. Suddenly, Cindy was thrown to the ground. She spun around in a rage, assuming Glenn had shoved her. But there was no one. Cindy hesitantly walked back into the house. She crept upstairs and there she found him, fast asleep. Often, when Cindy would finally fall asleep herself, she would feel the sensation that she would be leaving her body. Often she found she could fight it and stop it from happening. But once in a while she would seem to slip and find herself standing next to her sleeping body. Every time this happened, it, whatever it was, would attack her, violently beating her until she was able to wake herself up. She was convinced now. The house was haunted, but Glenn would have none of it. He didn't believe a word of it. They were tired, stressed, and hemorrhaging money that was being put into the property. That was all it was. But she was becoming increasingly isolated as well. Multiple members of her family would be hesitant to visit the house. They couldn't explain why, but it just made them uncomfortable. Even Cindy's beloved nephew Brandon told his aunt he didn't like it there. What's more, when she would try to phone her mother, the phone would stop working, seemingly at random points. Then it all took a very dark turn. The girls left for school one morning, leaving Cindy and Glenn in the house alone. Everything was quiet, but then Cindy heard Glenn's voice, calling her, saying, "Come here." Cindy complained she was tired, but still Glenn kept calling her. Cindy, frustrated, moved towards the bedroom. As she approached the hall leading to the bedroom, Glenn came running around the corner behind Cindy and placed a pillow over her face, throwing her to the floor and pinning her down with the pillow pressed firmly over her mouth and nose. Cindy was able to struggle out of his grasp, grabbed her keys and jumped in the van, fleeing as tears ran down her face. They had been arguing over the prior weeks, but this had come out of nowhere. Cindy didn't know what to do. She couldn't understand what had just happened. She stayed away from the house for the rest of the day until the girls were due to get home from school. She took them from the bus stop and back to the house, hesitating before she stepped inside. Glenn was there, but he just acted totally normal. Cindy didn't say a word. She just went about their normal evening rituals. It was as if the event hadn't even happened. But Glenn wasn't the only one that was displaying violent tendencies. Sean, the small boy the girls had been playing with, said something quite chilling to Brooke and Christy. At first, Cindy thought what the girls told her was concerning, but she could have passed it off as just a boy being rebellious. But the specificity of what he had said was the concerning part. He told Brooke he wanted to nail their mother to the wall at midnight. This wasn't his only outburst like this. One day, Glenn was standing on the roof repairing it, when Sean said he wanted to split Glenn's head open with the tool he was using. Both times the comments came out of nowhere. This was not the sort of thing Sean would normally say. He was a perfectly pleasant, polite boy most of the time, and his mother didn't understand it. Sean couldn't really explain why he said it either. The night after Sean's outburst, Cindy experienced her most vivid phenomenon so far. Again, she was asleep on the sofa when she became convinced that someone had yanked her eyelash, the incident we spoke about at the start of tonight's episode, followed by the swift sensation of what felt like a punch. But as I said earlier, there was no one there. One night, Cindy decided to challenge it. She was laying on the sofa, staring at the wall, thinking to herself that it was unfair that it could see her, but she couldn't see it. Seemingly, it responded to her. After falling asleep, Cindy was jerked awake by what felt like someone punching her in the arm again. But when she opened her eyes, she wasn't greeted by the usual empty living room. She glanced over to the wall, and standing next to it was a young boy, dressed like a child from the early 1900s. But Cindy found something comforting about the child. She said it looked exactly like her nephew, Brandon, her nephew who was refusing to come and visit. The boy seemed to gesture for Cindy to follow it, but she stayed on the sofa as he walked around the corner and vanished. Suddenly, Cindy felt overcome by exhaustion and fell asleep, her first full night of sleep in weeks. The next day, Cindy tried to understand where he had gone, where he was trying to take her, questioning whether it was the boy who had hit her. But she did seem to take it all very much at face value, rather than questioning if what she saw that night wasn't actually a young boy at all. What if it was something trying to keep her calm, so it could do to her what it needed to do? Glenn's anger flared up once again, over something seemingly innocent. A group of women had asked Cindy to get involved in a local yard sale on Main Street, but for some reason, Glenn was totally against this idea and grew unreasonably angry. He shouted and screamed at Cindy, but she was firm that she wasn't going to listen to him this time. Glenn began drinking and continued yelling. Worried about where this was going, Cindy phoned her mother and Glenn's mother, who also lived close by. Luckily, the phone was working for once. Glenn's mother convinced him to come and stay with them for the night, and he left, which was a relief for Cindy. But then, late that night, she heard someone trying to get through the front door. She had locked it so they couldn't get in, but then she heard shouting and screaming. It was Glenn. Cindy told him to leave, but instead he began to try and smash down the door. She threatened to call the police, but he didn't stop. He was completely out of control, screaming as he slammed into the door over and over. Cindy felt she didn't have a choice and called the police. But then suddenly, it all went quiet. She looked out the window to see Glenn walking around the corner. She hoped it was over. But then, her blood ran cold when she saw him walking back to the house, now carrying an axe. The police arrived before Glenn could break down the door with the axe. When they asked him why he had it, he claimed he had been chopping wood, but obviously they didn't believe this excuse. But despite this, Cindy didn't press charges, seemingly not fully believing that he was to blame for what's happened on this night. But at the very least, she didn't invite him back to the house. Glenn begged for a second chance, saying he would stop drinking, but this was obviously not a decision that Cindy could make overnight. She did attend the yard sale that kicked off the entire incident, but didn't stay for long, after she spotted Glenn driving around, repeatedly doing laps of the block, watching her. Shortly after this, Cindy found herself jolted awake at midnight on the sofa, once again by what felt like a punch. When she opened her eyes, she realised she wasn't alone, but this time it wasn't the boy. This time, standing by the wall, was a tall young man, dressed as an old-fashioned soldier. He stared at Cindy with intense anger. She turned her face away, absolutely terrified, praying he would leave her alone. Sure enough, when she turned back, he was gone. What is curious about this haunting is that while Cindy claims to have seen these apparitions, they rarely seem to return. In many cases, she sees them once and then the next time, it's something different, which seems to indicate that whatever was causing the more commonly reported phenomena, the beatings, the strange electrical issues, was something else. A few nights after this, Cindy was awoken again. This time she fought against every instinct to look at the wall, afraid of what she might see. She kept her focus on the TV. Eventually though, she needed to go to the toilet. She cautiously walked into the bathroom without issue, but as she was washing her hands, she glanced up into the mirror, and what looked back at her wasn't her reflection. Just for a moment, the face of an old woman, with sunken features and thin hair, stared into her eyes. Cindy backed away, grabbed the chain to turn off the light and leave, but as soon as she turned the light off, the light instantly flicked back on. Cindy ran out of the bathroom, terrified. The sensation of her heart skipping beats was starting to seriously worry her, and she went to the doctor to get it checked out. The problem was it would only happen when she was in the house, so all her test results came out fine. Much like Sean had prior, Christy started having unexpected violent outbursts, spitting and shouting at her mother, which felt totally out of character. Cindy would wake up almost every night. On the rare occasions that she was able to get proper sleep, she would have the out-of-body experiences that normally led to the sensations of being beaten. But interestingly, it wasn't always a case of her just walking around her house as it normally was, as had happened before. On one occasion she had fallen asleep and began that familiar dream of running down the stairs, being chased by someone. But when she made it to the bottom of the stairs, she glanced into her kitchen to see it as a laboratory. 2 men were standing there talking to one another, but she couldn't hear what they were saying. That was when she realised she was wearing a head torch, much like a coal miner. Before she could begin to understand what she was looking at, whatever had been chasing her caught up, and the beating began, more vicious than it ever had been. This wasn't like a normal dream though. Cindy felt like she had a certain degree of control. She desperately tried to return to her body so she could wake up, but then she said it felt like whatever this entity was pulling her back and into the dream world. She described that sensation as excruciating pain. Her bones cracked, she screamed in agony. As this happened, she claimed to hear a man's voice, repeating over and over, "It's evil. It's evil." Eventually, whatever was trying to keep her there gave up, and she jolted back into reality on the sofa. This was the incident that had scared her more than any other. She now became convinced whatever was in their home was trying to keep her in this out-of-body sleep state. She believed it wanted to kill her, or possibly something even worse than that. A couple of days later, the phone rang. Cindy answered it to hear a man's voice she didn't recognize. It simply said, "Can you talk, Cindy?" When she asked who it was, the phone went dead. By this point, Glenn had hesitantly been allowed back into the home, so far without any further incidents. But surprisingly, he didn't get angry about a strange man calling the house. Cindy said the next incident was the last time she ever got any sleep in the house. Again, she woke up at midnight. Her eyes glanced to the wall. There was nothing there. But when she looked back at the TV, she noticed in the corner of her eye a sort of pinkish smoke. Instantly, she panicked, convinced it was a fire. Ever since moving in, she had had an irrational fear of the place burning down, especially being fearful of the fireplace. In fact, she believed the fact that Glenn one day lit the fireplace, despite her constant insistence they shouldn't, was one of the reasons the activity had ramped up. When she looked at it properly, she said it looked like a large pink cloud floating out of the wall, and in the center of that cloud was some sort of energy. It floated towards her. The lights in the room flickered on and off. Cindy was terrified, frozen to the spot. This was it. She was sure of it. Whatever this was, it was the thing that had been attacking her. But then she was filled with even more fear when it seemed to pass through the wall, heading in the direction of where her daughters were. She knew she needed to go to them, but she was terrified, trying to pluck up the courage to move. trying to understand what she had seen. But before she could stand up, Christy came walking into the room. Her face looked different. Cindy said it almost didn't look like her own. It seemed twisted in anger. She yelled at Cindy, "I saw what you did, and I hate you." But it wasn't Christy's voice. It was deep and filled with rage. It was a momentary thing. Before, she just seemed to return back to her normal self. Unsure why she had said that, or what she even meant by it. By the morning, she didn't even seem to have any memory of the incident. Glenn still seemed to be very dismissive of her claims, but luckily, Cindy's family seemed to be much more open-minded about it, and she confided in her uncle, mother and sister about what had been going on. Initially, she felt like she couldn't stay in the house anymore. It had only been 10 weeks since they moved in, but she was at her breaking point. She had even developed a stutter after all the stress. She decided again that she didn't want Glenn around, that she needed to do what was right for herself and her children. While at her mother's house trying to decide what to do, she and her mother finally decided to explain to her kids what was going on. But surprisingly, Brooke responded that she already knew. She had seen it herself, experienced it herself. The girls referred to it as the evil thing. They could feel it around them all the time, feel the sudden changes in temperature. She said it had never hurt them, but one night she felt like she had floated out of her bed. Christy just listened, looking nervous, not speaking, but it was clear something was on her mind. Cindy decided not to go back. They would stay at her mother's or anyone else who could house them temporarily, but they could not stay in that house anymore. Cindy's uncle convinced her to talk to a priest, saying the church could help them and that in the meantime, she should read from a Bible out loud, something that very quickly became a part of her life. She refused to ever go to bed, even when staying at someone else's house, without a Bible by her side. Cindy initially spoke to a priest at a local church, who seemed to not take her claims seriously at all. The second priest they got in touch with seemed a little more open to it, but was still very hesitant to get heavily involved. Initially, he began questioning Cindy about if she was drinking heavily, or on drugs. Then, after hearing her claims about her out-of-body experiences, he began asking her if she had seen A Nightmare on Elm Street, seemingly suggesting that she was simply taking elements from the movie, either intentionally or subconsciously. He also questioned her on if she had ever engaged in any form of occult practice. Cindy admitted that she had used tarot in the past, and the priest seemed very keen on her removing all items like that from the house. He then asked her to go see a doctor for a psychological evaluation. Cindy was very worried about the evaluation, convinced the doctor would claim she was crazy. But after a long interview, in which Cindy explained not just what had happened in her home, but across her entire life, the doctor apparently told her she was sane, but that he believed she had some sort of psychic ability. Now, the second half of Cindy's story is a little tricky to talk about in a cohesive way. She left the house, moving between her mother's, sisters, nieces, and various other friends and family members throughout this period of effectively being homeless. She would have to return to the home on occasions to collect items or use the washing machine, but she kept her time there to a real minimum. What makes this part of her story so hard to talk about is there are so many different family members, friends and acquaintances who seem to become involved. There's a lot of back and forth to the house, and at times some real baffling decisions that we will talk about in more detail later. So I'll be providing a very condensed version of the events that took place after leaving the house, mostly highlighting some of the more notable moments. One of the bigger developments involved Cindy getting in contact with a psychic, which the priest didn't think was a good idea, but the psychic seemed to provide Cindy with a lot more insight into what was going on. The psychic's name was Carrie, and from their initial phone call she seemed to know things about Cindy's situation before she even explained to her what was going on. She told Cindy she wasn't crazy, that what was in her home was, in her words, demon-like. She believed it was feeding off of Cindy's energy. Specifically, it was playing on her fears. Thanksgiving rolled around and a number of family members came to Cindy's mother's house to celebrate. But even this wasn't a moment of relief for her, as they told her, as they drove past Cindy's house, they had seen a man standing in the window. The dog had been left at the house in the back garden. Glenn had been returning to feed it and check on it, while they figured out what to do next, as Cindy couldn't take it to her mother's, and Glenn was also staying with his parents. But seemingly, Glenn wasn't the man they had spotted. What made it weirder is that this wasn't a one-off occurrence. So many people would report seeing a man in the window, or the lights in the house all suddenly being turned on at night. They called out another electrician to see if there was an explanation for the lights all coming on their own. Interestingly, the electrician said it looked like someone had been messing with the wiring of the house, exactly as the first man they had called out had said, and fixed. Sean's mother, Kelly, who lived in the trailer next door, had offered to keep an eye on the property for Cindy, and on occasion had spotted trespassers coming up the hill to try and check out the haunted house, as rumours began to circulate in the area. But every time Cindy phoned her to go and check if there was a man in the house, there would be no one there, and the house would be locked up. But later, Kelly admitted that she too would see the man at the window, despite there never being any sign of someone entering. On one occasion, Cindy had to return to the house to collect a dress shortly after Christmas. She plucked up the courage to walk to one of the upstairs rooms, where most people had claimed to see the man. She opened the door slowly, and sure enough, she saw him. She instantly knew what he, or it, was. This was what they were now all calling the evil in the house. Cindy turned and ran out of the house as quickly as she could. One night, exhausted and stressed beyond belief, Cindy finally fell into a deep sleep at her mum's place. As soon as she did, one of those now familiar vivid dreams hit. But this time it was different. She was standing on a hill. At first she didn't recognize it, but soon she began to notice the similarities. This was the hill her home sat on, but the house wasn't there, just the hill and trees. But she wasn't alone. She glanced further down the hill, where her house should have been, and there she saw a circle of people in black robes. She stood and watched as the men knelt and stood over and over, chanting, but she couldn't hear what they were saying. Then suddenly they started digging a hole in the centre of the spot where her home should be. They soon dug out what looked like a wooden box. When they pried it open, Cindy saw that there was a body inside. Cindy shot awake, her Bible still open on her chest. She phoned Carrie the psychic again, who informed her that someone was buried under her home. In fact, the hill was covered in bodies. What she had seen was something that had happened a long time ago. Cindy had no interest in moving back into the house, but the idea of selling it scared her too. What if she was subjecting another family to the torment she was facing? But Carrie convinced her that she and her abilities were the reason that the entity was focused on her, and that if a new family moved in, they likely wouldn't face anything like this. Glenn was still claiming to be skeptical, but he said he was willing to do anything to get their family back together and back in the house. He offered to tear down the house and build a new one. He said he would dig up the whole hill hunting for bodies if he had to, but Cindy said it wouldn't make any difference, Glenn's insistence that nothing was wrong though became a little harder to believe when Cindy visited the house one day and realised he had put up a crucifix on the door of the house. But why did Cindy put so much weight into these admittedly vivid dreams? Well, she claimed to be sensitive to the paranormal all throughout her life. She believed that she had been visited by dead family members, as had numerous other members of her family. But she also claims that she would, on occasion, see things before they happened, or things that she shouldn't be able to know about in her dreams. One example she gave of this was a particularly chilling story. One night, years prior to moving into the house, she claimed to have had a dream in which she witnessed a woman being brutally attacked and sexually assaulted by a group of men. She couldn't see the woman's face, but when she jolted awake, she said it felt so real. The sounds, the smells, the vivid details of her torment, and the blood that she saw. The next day, she received a call from her sister, telling her that a mutual friend of theirs had been murdered. When she explained what had happened, it sounded almost identical to her dream. Then her sister told her it had happened around 3 AM the night before, the exact time that Cindy had awoken from her dream. After a lot of phone calls and back and forth conversations, the priest finally came out to help Cindy with the house. He performed a blessing and Cindy felt that it had actually worked, like the presence was gone. So much so that the next day she began to move back in with the girls. Almost straight away, Cindy felt uncomfortable, like something was wrong. But she tried to put it to the back of her mind, hoping she was just paranoid. Then she heard Brooke screaming, claiming it was still there. She rushed to the stairs to see her daughter being held up by something unseen, unable to come down the stairs. Cindy yelled as much in anger as in fear, and it seemed to let her daughter go. This was the incident that made her realise there was no hope. The house was put up for sale, but initially it was only viewed by locals who wanted to get a look at the haunted house. During this period of time, Cindy visited the house with numerous friends who were curious and wanted to experience the phenomena themselves, and even a group of paranormal investigators. All of them experienced some level of activity. While the house was up for sale, they would have to regularly visit to try and keep the place clean for potential buyers. But Cindy would try and be in and out as quickly as possible. One day, Cindy ended up visiting the house, and Brooke came along to help her mother with some chores. Cindy walked into the living room and spotted something weird. The girls had a couple of old-fashioned dolls that held umbrellas. One of them was on top of the TV, facing away towards the fireplace. It was odd, but she assumed that one of the many visitors to the house had put it there at some point. Brooke, glued to her mother's side, followed her as she went to pick up some curtains, and took them to the bathroom downstairs to scrub them clean in the bathtub. The bathroom that looked out into the living room. The room where Cindy had seen so many things that she couldn't explain. Suddenly, Brooke slammed the bathroom door shut. Cindy's daughter was terrified. When she asked what she was doing, Brooke told her mother it was looking at them. Cindy asked who. Brooke said, the doll. When they finally opened the door, sure enough the doll had turned. It was now facing them. They left the house quickly. In the autumn of 1992, around 15 months after she had initially purchased the house on the hill, Cindy sold the property. Her and her children moved into a large trailer, not too far away so she could stay close to family, but she and Glenn finally parted ways for good. While she continued to experience what many would call paranormal events throughout the years, it was nothing close to what she had experienced in that house. She still believes that what they encountered there was something truly evil. Cindy and her daughters still say they have nightmares about the place, and while it doesn't seem like they were followed, all of them still sleep with the lights on and an open Bible close by. The home was purchased by a young couple with a daughter from out of the area. Apparently within a few months they too left, claiming their daughter had seen something that they could not explain. So what really happened? There's a lot to unpack here. As I stated in my intro, I sort of stumbled across this case by accident really, while researching another story. I couldn't believe it initially. This was a story with detailed direct sources, had featured on television, yet seemed to have become forgotten about by and large. Shockingly few people seem to have covered this in the YouTube or podcasting sphere. I think once I started delving into it more, I started to understand partially why that may be the case. Seemingly Cindy didn't really talk about her experiences with anyone outside of her friends and family, but she did finally self-publish a book in 2006 detailing her story. What made her decide to do this after so long, I'm a little unsure. But despite just being self-published, it seemingly caught the attention of the producers of the TV series A Haunting, who very quickly made an episode detailing her story. Although it appears Cindy wasn't too happy with how they told her story and didn't find it accurate. She has in the last year also done an interview for the channel The Ghost Files, which I hadn't stumbled across before, but is an amazingly underrated channel that is basically producing sort of early 2000 style paranormal documentaries. As far as I can tell, these are the only sources of Cindy and her family's story that are available. For the purposes of this episode, I mostly relied on what Cindy claimed happened in her book, using the Ghost Files interview to confirm details, and the A Haunting episode to see what elements they decided to keep in. Let's begin by talking about why I think this story is difficult to tell. Cindy has written this book herself, seemingly without a ghostwriter or potentially even an editor. She is not a writer. I don't say this to belittle her, but she is simply someone trying to tell her story as she believed it happened, meaning this book isn't always an easy read. Events happen fast in the book, and as I alluded to earlier, particularly in the latter half, there are so many friends and family members that get involved, some that only stick around for a paragraph or two, that it becomes tricky to try and explain the events in what will likely be an hour-long video. If you want to know the full detailed story, I do strongly recommend getting a copy. While it is a raw account, I think that adds a little to the authenticity, maybe more so than it may feel hearing me speak about some of these events. I've told you Cindy's story, so from here this will be more my personal feelings on the case. As always, I will try to present both sides, the skeptical arguments that could explain away what happened, as well as the paranormal. I'll be honest, at times I found Cindy's story frustrating, particularly in the latter half. The whole story of them moving in and experiencing the haunting is super compelling and interesting, but once they move out, there are countless decisions being made that I just couldn't wrap my head around, that I will admit at times made me doubtful of what truly happened here. One of the reasons this episode has come out a little later than usual is because there were quite a few moments during preparing it where I had second thoughts about even covering it. But one of the things I said early on when creating these videos is I wanted to try and remove my personal thoughts on a topic when presenting the initial story as much as possible. So I shouldn't not cover a story because I personally think some details are maybe a bit sketchy. I want to really present these cases and leave it up to you as a listener to decide what you think really happened. That said, I think this might be the most skeptical I've been of a case since the Wheat Sheaf episode. However, I want to be clear, that doesn't mean I don't think something happened here. I just have some doubts over parts of it. I'm curious about the doctor who apparently told her she had nothing wrong with her, but in the words quoted in the book, just had too much psychic ability. which feels like an unusual quote coming from a doctor. But mostly my reluctance to be all in on this case centres around the second half of Cindy's story, as I said. She seems to genuinely believe this house was haunted by something that she felt was evil. It had physically attacked her multiple times. It had caused uncharacteristically violent behaviour in the children. Her boyfriend had tried to break into the house with an axe. One of her daughters appeared to be possessed, at least temporarily, by it, and the other claimed it had made her float in her bed. Cindy said at one point she thought it wanted to kill her. Cindy makes a very sensible decision that we rarely see in these cases, and moves out pretty promptly, but where I struggle is that she keeps going back. Now, a lot of these events I did skip over in my initial retelling for the sake of clarity, but we'll talk about these instances a little more here. A lot of her returning visits make sense. She has to clean the children's clothing and bedding, something that was tricky to do as her mother's one-bedroom apartment. She would meet Glenn at the house, who would return daily to feed the dog, but she would often refuse to go in the house alone without him there. I can kind of accept this, but each return to the house is normally met with some level of activity, sometimes genuinely disturbing encounters. On more than one occasion, she believes the brakes on her car stopped working because of the entity. But despite this, at times she returns to the house for things like a bottle of shampoo or cooking supplies, which, if the story is accurate, feels like a very dangerous risk to get a bottle of shampoo. Sean's mother calls her one night to tell her there are trespassers near the house, but when Cindy arrives she realises they are just interested in the haunting and are polite, so she gives them a tour. She takes countless people into the house to experience it for themselves. In more than one instance, those people bring children with them. She even makes numerous trips back to the house, bringing her daughter Brooke with her, mostly just because her other daughter is too scared to even return. In the book she even does this just a few sentences after claiming that she wouldn't take anyone back into the house ever again. Does this make her story seem fake? I'm not necessarily saying that, but the decision making on display does make me question if the activity she was experiencing really was as vicious as she makes out. While I admit it's easy to judge these actions when you're removed from a situation, it does feel odd to me. All of this without even questioning the fact that she, at least temporarily, welcomes a man back into her children's life who was skulking around outside their property with an axe and tried to suffocate her. So while we're on that point, let's talk about Glenn and what I think is one of the more disturbing aspects of this story. The idea of the husband or boyfriend's character changing and becoming more aggressive while living in a haunted house does almost feel like a trope at this point. It's something we see time and time again in haunted house cases. But there are some details that suggest this example isn't quite as standard as that. In the very first chapter of the book, Cindy states that she and Glenn argued a lot. This was one of the reasons why they hadn't got married, despite being together for so long. She also makes it very clear that she is the one buying the house with her money, not him. Glenn comes off as a very controlling personality in her life before they even move in, convincing her to buy the house. Later, after living there for a short while, they argue constantly. He doesn't want her to get involved with the yard sale. He gets angry about her wanting to go back to work part-time. He lights the fireplace despite her being very clear that for some reason the fireplace scares her. I've only included a handful of his angry outbursts, but of course the two most notable moments we did talk about: the pillow and the axe. It's frustrating to read how after these incidents, Cindy seems to meet up with Glenn over and over again. But of course, it's very easy to say as an outsider. It's silly for someone to keep going back to an abusive partner. These things are never clean cut, and people do go back even when their safety is at risk. But I think it's Glenn that maybe gives us the most plausible, skeptical conclusion to what has happened here. Cindy has experienced a lot of trauma throughout her life, that is alluded to in brief moments throughout the book. At the age of 8, her stepfather was murdered right outside their home. Her parents divorced. Her friend was brutally murdered. Her mother faces a long-term sickness, and even Cindy's own long-term injury. She also has a strong belief in the paranormal, believing dead relatives have visited her since she was a child, and this is a belief that has been passed through generations of her family, with even her daughters apparently giving her messages from the dead. You couple this with being pressured into buying a house that she didn't want, and at the very least being in what appears to be an emotionally abusive relationship that turns violent later. It becomes hard not to look at the fact that this could all be related to mental health. The entire situation feels very depressing. Even the way Cindy refers to the evil in the book feels almost like a metaphor for depression. Were the recurring dreams of being chased and beaten actually just a manifestation of her fears of Glenn? Were her children's claims just simply a case of two children in a troubled environment picking up on their mother's fears and beliefs? It's also worth noting that, unlike many cases, the family is surrounded by believers. Most of Cindy's family seem at the very least open to the idea that this is a haunting, and they quite often add their own thoughts into what is happening and introduce Cindy to people who firmly believe in this sort of thing, constantly adding fuel to the fire of her firm belief that something evil is in her home. As always, there is also an environmental possibility to all this. Cindy reports countless issues with the property, leaving open the possibilities of the old faithful reasons to dismiss claims of the paranormal, gas leaks and mould. The fact that this place seemed to be practically falling apart could also add further weight to the mental strain they were under. The fact that the previous owners claimed they had no issues doesn't hold much weight for me. They weren't exactly going to say, "Sorry, we sold you a dump. Enjoy." Could this be an outright hoax? For attention or money? As always, yes, it could be. There is no tangible evidence. All of the events have been told to us from Cindy's perspective for the most part. But she certainly hasn't made any significant money from this case, nor achieved fame. While getting a book deal for your haunted houses seems a reasonable plan in stories we cover from the 70s and 80s, going into the 2000s, these really successful paranormal books just really don't exist anymore. The haunting also feels a little too weird, and Cindy's retelling is so specific in odd little details that makes me struggle to believe in the idea of it being a hoax. But the chances of it being completely accurate, well, I doubt that as well. What I do find interesting though is that a decade separates Cindy's book and the interview on the Ghost Files, and her story doesn't change. Her daughters, now grown up, seem to genuinely believe this happened. Cindy even makes light of some of the more dramatic moments of the A Haunting retelling. It would be so easy for her to jump on that spiced up version of her story if all she wanted was attention, but she doesn't. She sticks to her version of events, the way she perceived it all playing out. I feel like I've maybe gone a little harder on this case than I sometimes do, but I want to be clear I'm not totally dismissing it. Yes, there's a lot of elements that I struggle with personally. Yes, I think mental health may have played a significant part in what's happened here. But I don't believe Cindy or her family are liars. She purchased a home and then essentially made herself homeless, and ended up living in a trailer, all within the span of a year, because of what she believed was in that house. I don't think you would do that without good reason. And while we are hearing all of this from Cindy's perspective, there were a lot of other people that seemingly claimed to experience different levels of activity when they visited the home. There is also the idea that we have spoken about countless times before, that if the demonic is real, or if people can be sensitive to a world beyond our own, Would it not make sense for people going through trauma and hardships to become the focus of these darker forces? And of course, there is the old poltergeist theory, that maybe if Cindy really did have some sort of psychic ability, if such a thing were possible, that maybe there wasn't a haunting at all as such. Instead, what she was witnessing was some sort of mental manifestations being created from her abilities. Abilities that she didn't have any way to fully understand. I mentioned this in the latest episode of Night Drive Paranormal, but I think it's relevant here too. When we hear these stories of the paranormal, it's important to remember that if they truly happened, no one really knows what they experienced. Every retelling we hear is clouded by that person's beliefs, their life experiences, the things that other people who claim to be experts on the topic tell them. But if there is any legitimacy to it, no one truly understands the paranormal. It's all purely guesswork. We all put weight into some element of these stories, while happily turning a blind eye to others to try and make it fit into our own worldview. I firmly believe that Cindy Sarro experienced something in that house on the hill, but what that something was, we may never know. But to her, it was something truly evil, and something she hopes to never encounter ever again. That's all for this episode of the Tape Library. As I said, this was a bit of a tricky one, but I hope you all enjoyed it. If you did and you're new here, then please do consider subscribing. If you're watching on YouTube, we're growing ever closer to that goal of 400,000 subscribers. But also, so many more of you seem to be joining me through the podcast version on Spotify, and on other platforms now as well. So welcome to all you new folk. I've got one last episode of the Tape Library, and another night drive to bring you, before we round out 2025, and I take a short break. But rest assured, I have the first few episodes of 2026 planned in, and they're going to be some really interesting ones. So I hope you stick around for another year of exploring the unknown. Before I say goodbye, let's thank those wonderful supporters who keep the show running with their kind donations. Our Tape Library archivists Yenok, Aura, Lee, Borox Johnson, sorry if I pronounced that wrong, Now and Zen, Pat McShay, Lyra, Yoinks and Away, MJW, Emulated Phoenix, Jamie Long, Lisa Marie Sheridan, Shan Harding, Gaffy with a G, Rosary Sudrabin, Plum Blossom, Gina Britton, Emily Carlin, Sarah Boyd, Thomas Boatwright, Stephen Lutman, Crystal E, West Virginia Vegetable Man, Dawn Swan, Tina S, Sean Miller, Juno, Joseph Condurla, Jolly Jedi, Panther Paw, Pixelina, Joe, The Crimson DM, The Detective, Jean Janine, Lady Bet Noir, Darla, Alfredo Sandoval, G-Raw, Midia Zabine, Dominic DeAngelis, Dagan O'Dorleg, Judith Hacker, Eric Salas, Mirashard, Adeline, Ash Loves Books, Tracy Torello, Gabrielle, Umika Grimm and Sandy Lusk. Our lead archivists, Win Lewis, Plague Doctor is In, Quirky Joseph, Amy Stubblefield, The Original Deer, Emmy Bartley, Ridiculous, London Grace, Melissa Harrison, Emperor Franz, Old Soul Like Mine, Xavier Rangel, Sag El Kali, Alex O'Neill, Tyler Michael, Alex Goldberg, Van Yell, Brian Baker, and 1000th Ghost. And our top bosses, the Grand Overseers, Harrison the Ogre-Lord, Leah Carmella, Bad Diddley, the God Emperor of Mankind, Katie, Morning Rain 2619, Agent 355, and of course, Queen of Flatulence. As I mentioned before, I've been having some issues with the members list on Patreon, so if your shout out is missed or the name used isn't right, please do drop me a message on Patreon. And of course, thank you to all my junior archivists and YouTube members as well. It all helps to keep me bringing you these episodes. If you're one of the few who made it to the very end of the episode, I've got one final unusual detail to let you know about this story. One of the various people who visited the house after Cindy initially left the place was apparently a local professional wrestler. So if you made it to the end and got to hear that weird little bit of trivia, write the word "still chair" in the comments so I know. And also just to confuse the hell out of anyone who skipped this bit. Until next time, my friends, pleasant dreams.